probably spent some time in a classroom, sat behind a desk, fiddled with a pen while the teacher drones on about some esoteric subject that you're sure you're never gonna need. And that's pretty typical of education in our world. It's an endurance sport, a slow, rigorous process built on years of rote memorization, grueling exams, and the steady climb driven by the scientific method. We have built our entire civilization on the idea that knowledge is hard won. But what happens when you introduce a shortcut? What if a student doesn't study thermodynamics for 4 years? Instead, they cast a fireball in 4 seconds. What happens when your major in college isn't decided by your interests, but by the literal blood in your veins or the centuries-long lifespan of your race? Magic and non-human biology don't just add flavor to a story. They pretty fundamentally break and rebuild how a society passes down knowledge. And that's what I want to talk about today. A world-building framework for the educational disruptors. We're going to explore why magic doesn't make life easier. It might actually be the thing that destroys the scientific method and tears the social fabric of a fantasy world apart. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. Before we can understand how magic breaks things, we have to look at what magic is breaking. Historically, education has always been a mirror of what society values. In ancient times, education was often informal and embedded in oral traditions. You learned by watching and imitating, hunting, gathering, or crafting with your family and tribe. It was a practical, survival-based methodology that was rooted in the authority of the elder generation. As civilizations like Egypt and China grew, formal systems of education emerged. But these weren't for everyone. They were temple or school-based programs designed specifically for the elite, focusing on writing, mathematics, and moral development to prepare these elite for civil service. While ancient Egypt was focusing on training scribes for the state, the Greeks were obsessing over the ideal citizen. They introduced the concept of paideia. That's probably mispronounced. Anyway, a system designed to polish a human being into their best possible version. Their education wasn't about learning a trade, it was about becoming the best version of you. That method of education gave us the Socratic method, the idea that a teacher should challenge a student to think rather than just spoon-feeding them facts. They took subjects like geometry and astronomy and treated them as tools to understand the very fabric of reality. But philosophers do not an army make, and the Greeks fell under the more practical sphere of the Romans, who focused their education on oratory, law, and classical knowledge. Essentially, learning how to speak well and rule effectively. While the Western Roman Empire was busy having convulsions that would eventually settle into the Europe we know, the torch of systemic inquiry didn't just go out, fortunately. During the Islamic Golden Age, scholars preserved that ancient classical knowledge and transitioned it into a system of rigorous inquiry. They read the ancient knowledge and they expanded on it, asking questions about the world in a way that would eventually lead to the development of the scientific method. Eventually. But first, there came the Middle Ages, where the church took the reins in Europe. Education became synonymous with religious doctrine, Latin, and philosophy, primarily accessible only to the clergy and the nobility. Knowledge and books were largely preserved in monasteries, and actually those monks were pretty educated. They could read in multiple languages, including Arabic, and they had extensive herbal and healing knowledge, which is probably why they make the best beer and why you can still buy Trappist beer in Europe. However, the monasteries were dots of light in a sea of people whose education was pretty much left to guilds, learning from your parents, and otherwise catch as catch can. It wasn't until the Renaissance that we saw the revival of classical knowledge and humanistic ideals, which finally expanded the curriculum to include literature, history, and science, and the birth of the scientific method. However, education still cost a bomb and was restricted to fairly wealthy people. The rest of us peasants were still on the guilds and parents program. But the Renaissance laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution, and that sucker changed everything. This era necessitated mass schooling to create an educated workforce so that they could read instructions and work in a factory. This is where we got the model most of us recognize today: standardized curricula, overcrowded classrooms, and rigid testing. We moved away from apprenticeship and informal learning toward formal, institutionalized schooling controlled by the state, where pupils were fed facts that they needed to commit to memory. Now, do not get me wrong. I had one of those educations, and I appreciate the facts that were drummed into me. But I appreciate even more my mother, who taught me to ask why, and the 2 or 3 teachers who were willing to stay after school and discuss root causes and principles with me. And that wasn't part of the standardized curricula. If you want a further exploration of the various teaching methods, check out my video on that topic in the information card. In any case, in every one of these eras, there is one clear, non-negotiable link between effort and mastery. Whether you were a monk copying manuscripts or a factory worker learning a trade, you had to put in the time to gain the knowledge. But magic changes that math. It introduces 2 major problems: the convenience trap and the effect of miracles on the scientific method. But before we unpack the effect of magic, give me one moment to invite you to sign up for my newsletter. It comes out 4 times a year, and it's not just a collection of videos. It includes original content about world building, an update on my writing projects, and my thoughts on writing, a deep dive into a topic via a blog post, and more. Also, all subscribers get a free novella every year, and you get to ask questions, which I answer. So, follow the link down below and sign up for Marie's Deep Thoughts and get your free book today. And now, let's get back to education and magic. First, let's talk about the convenience trap. In our world, if you want to understand how to build a bridge over a gap, see what I did there? I'd see myself out, but it's my house. Okay, so if you want to bridge the gap, you have to study civil engineering, physics, and the properties of stone and steel. It takes years. But in a fantasy world, if a mage can simply conjure a bridge or levitate the wagon across it, the incentive to understand the how of the bridge disappears. Magic introduces a shortcut to mastery that mirrors some of our modern struggles with things like AI-assisted learning or short-form content. It offers immediate gratification. But when you skip the grind, you lose the intellectual rigor that comes with it. And here's a side note, kids, because I know that many of you are kind of college age according to my YouTube stats. Don't use AI to cheat at school and college. It's the only time of your life when you're basically paid to gain knowledge, and it lays down the foundation of your intellectual rigor. Read the books. It will help you a lot more than just asking one of the LLMs for a summary of the content. Anyway, in a magical society, why would a student spend a decade studying anatomy and herbalism if they can learn a greater heal spell in an afternoon? In a world that has always had magic, you might never develop educational institutions. Mages would be taught the skills of magic that keep society going. And everyone else? Well, they'd get educated only as far as they need to do their job. except for the rare few who are rich enough and curious enough to pursue knowledge for its own sake. And that's why I think it's valid that a lot of fantasy worlds stagnate from a technological and scientific perspective. If magic can just fix your problems, well, why do you need to go mucking around with steam engines? Those things are dangerous, you know. And this leads us to the second and actually more dangerous problem with magic, the death of the scientific method. Science relies on observation, repeatability, and empirical testing. Magic, by its very nature, often bypasses these rules. When you have a miracle that just works, even if no one understands why, you stop looking for natural explanations. Basically, it's a thought stopper. Let's say I've seen you cast a fireball, so I know you can just break the laws of physics anytime you like. Now you tell me that the sky is blue because magic made it blue. I'm not going to question that because I can't prove or disprove a miracle. And because I don't question it, I never learned that sunlight reaches the Earth's atmosphere and is scattered in all directions by the gases and particles in the air. Blue light is scattered more than the other colors because it travels as shorter, smaller waves. In short, I never learn about the properties of light because miracles and magic can basically make physics a suggestion, not a law. And historical evidence shows us that when a society starts relying on black box solutions, they stop innovating. We saw it with the Greek scientific inquiry stalling after the fall of the Roman Empire. In your world, if healing magic is ubiquitous, medical science won't just slow down. It won't develop. Why research germ theory when a priest can cure a plague with a prayer? And so the basic method of create a hypothesis and test that hypothesis just never applies because my hypothesis can be fireballed by a mage. And before you say you could include magic in the scientific method, consider that instead of a peer-reviewed journals and open documentation, magic tends to pull knowledge into closeted guilds and esoteric traditions because of its power. Magic is a very real, very personal power to a mage. It's not scientific knowledge, which in and of itself doesn't give power, and it's not the implementation of that knowledge which requires many people working together. Magic makes an individual a superhero or villain, and as such, magical knowledge is about who has the secret of the word of power, not who has the best data. Mages work together only in secret because of that, and they control who has the power. Kind of like nuclear non-proliferation, but even more so. So I don't know if something like the scientific method would even develop in a magic world, and that can have a pretty fundamental impact on education. But magic isn't the only thing in fantasy that can impact education. Non-humans can change your schools too. So let's talk about them next. When we talk about non-humans in fantasy, elves, dwarves, orcs, you name it, we usually focus on their cool armor or their combat stats or sometimes their weird cultures. But from a world-building perspective, their biology and culture would absolutely wreck a standardized school system. Think about the elven long life problem. If an elf lives for 1,000 years, their perception of time is fundamentally different from ours. Imagine being a human student in a mixed-race university. You're stressed out because you have 4 years to get your degree before you can start a career and a family. Meanwhile, your elven roommate has been taking Intro to History for 40 years because they want to really soak in the nuances. For an elf, a human's entire education looks like a frantic, shallow cram session. For a human, elven education looks like a bureaucratic nightmare of procrastination. How do you even set a curriculum for two species that don't share the same concept of deadline? Then you have the issue of innate traits, the aristocracy of institutions. In our world, we try, or at least in theory, in some parts of the world, to make education an equalizer. But if certain races are born with a literal biological head start, like an innate connection to magic that lets them break the physics rules, it reinforces a glass ceiling that no amount of studying can break. It's not just about class anymore, it's about your DNA. This can turn education into a tool for stratification rather than mobility. You end up with strength-based apprenticeships for some and longevity-linked wisdom for others, creating a society where your species dictates your career before you've even learned to read. Check out my video on immortals and economies for more thoughts about this. We also can't ignore the cultural divide. Education is how we pass on our values. But what happens when those values are incompatible? If a dwarf believes that knowledge is a sacred secret to be kept within a mountain guild, and a human believes knowledge should be printed and sold in a bookstore, it's more than a disagreement. At that point, you have a systemic conflict, and every classroom becomes a battleground for cultural assimilation or resistance. And of course, we're speculating on what happens with a human-based education system that has non-humans in it. But it's worth flipping that around and thinking about how non-humans handle an education and what they would do with a human who attended their schools. Are there any humans in Alvin University slowly going mad because of the quantity and slowness of the work? It's worth thinking about. In short, adding non-humans doesn't just add variety to your world's population. It creates a hybrid or conflicted curriculum that challenges the idea of what basic education even means. Okay, so now we have a clear idea of what might happen to an education system in a fantasy world. Let's talk about potential remedies. You've got a few options to handle education in fantasy, ranging from leaning into the chaos to carefully engineering your system to fit a specific vibe. First, you can just roll with the changes. If your world has had magic for 10,000 years, it shouldn't look like the 19th century London. Accept that the scientific method might not exist. Your schools might just be guilds where masters pass down black box secrets to a few chosen apprenticeships. This is the apprentice model. It's high stakes, highly personal, and keeps magic as a guarded resource. It's perfect for a world of mystery where knowledge is power. But what if you want that gothic university feel? You can treat magic as science. This is where you design your magic system to be logical and repeatable. You have peer-reviewed spell theory and public institutions where magic is studied with the same rigor as physics. Think of it like the University of Salamanca Faculty of Magic. It's structured, academic, and preserves the spirit of inquiry because even the mages are constantly trying to find the why behind the how. Then there's the aristocracy of institutions approach. If you want a society with deep class tensions, you limit magic to the elite. Here, education is a tool for segregation. The commoners get standardized classroom experience, learning basic maths and reading, while the nobility gets the Royal Academy to learn the shortcut of magic. This creates a world where the power gap is reinforced by what people learn in the classroom. And finally, there's ubiquitous integration. This is the mass classroom model. Here, imagine a world where magic is so common it's basically a trade skill. You have magical colleges and standardized testing for spellcasting proficiency. Kids aren't just taking SATs, they're taking the National Monarch Competency Exam. It democratizes power, but it also commodifies it. Magic stops being a miracle and starts being just another subject you have to pass to get a job at the local apothecary. No matter which way you go, the key is to be intentional. Don't just drop a modern school into a magical world and call it a day. Ask yourself, who is allowed to learn? How long does it take them? And what happens to people who can't cast the spells? So, you're still here? You awesome person, you. Okay, while the names of the absolute legends who support this channel scroll by, let's have an after-class chat. You know, we spent this whole time talking about how magic breaks schools, but can we talk about the logistics of a dragon in a dorm room? Because my research touched on non-human biology and I couldn't stop thinking about the plumbing. If you have a roommate who breathes fire, or a dryad who needs a specific soil pH to sleep, the educational part of university is probably the least of your worries. I mean, it's one thing if everyone is at least bipedal, even if they have weird dietary requirements. What happens if you have Shelob's kids coming to school? Or fairies so small they can't write on a normal-sized page? So they have to write on these itty-bitty papers that the teacher then has to grade their answers with a magnifying glass. There is so much weirdness you can introduce with non-humans in a magic school, especially one that functions as a boarding school. And heck, we didn't even get into sentient libraries that reorganize themselves while you're trying to find a source for your thesis. That's a level of academic stress no human should have to endure. Anyway, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the messy intersection of spells and standardized testing, make sure you hit all the buttons. You know the ones. Subscribe, hype, thumbs up, and so on. If you made it all the way here, leave me a book in the comments. And if you want more content from me, check out my video on creating a magical education specifically. And I will see you soon for another one.